What is up, guys? It's your buddy Blue Spooky here. I wanted to ask you guys a question before we start. Since pretty much all the videos are an hour and 30 minutes lately, do you want me to keep the Megamix name, or would you prefer I go back to doing so-and-so amount of stories, volume whatever? Let me know what you guys think, because I'm rather conflicted on it myself. Besides that though, if you guys end up enjoying this video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Doing any of those really helps the channel and the video to do well, and ensures I can keep making these for a long time to come. I do my best to make sure that every story in these videos has not been read by me before. However, because I've read so many stories, some may slip through the cracks sometimes. So please understand if that happens. It's hard to keep track of every single one when I've read like 10,000 of them over the 10 years I've been doing this. If you guys would like to support the channel further than you already do, please be sure to click the join button. It should be somewhere around the subscribe button. You can support the channel for an additional $2 at the lowest tier, and you get special emoticons next to your name when you comment, and that you can use when you comment as well. No content is locked behind the paywall, of course. It's just something additional you can do if you'd like to support the channel further than you already do. Just watching is a big help already. Anyway, without further ado, I will get right into the stories, and I hope you guys enjoy them. Have a great day. Honestly, I don't even know where to begin with this one. It just happened so suddenly, and it will probably stick with me for the rest of my life. I'm a man and still in high school. I live with my dad as well. In 2020, my grandma unfortunately passed away due to smoking and COPD. She lived right next to us, and her trailer was about 30 seconds away from our house. You can imagine how you could see what went down in her trailer from where we were. Well, fast forward to now, though. Her trailer had been empty for 3 years now. I obviously thought it would stay that way, but I was wrong. Enough of all that, though. I have a dog that I always let out at night. I let him out this night just like any other ordinary night. I was letting him out on the porch and watching him use the bathroom out there. My grandma's trailer was to the right of me, and up until now, I'd never seen what I saw tonight. I let my dog out and was watching him go, like I said, until I happened to look over at my grandma's trailer. I saw a light flick on in the kitchen. I could see it through the window. The confusion I felt in that moment was unexplainable. As soon as that happened, I didn't really know what to think. What the hell? Was someone in my grandma's old trailer, or was I just seeing things? As I was staring at the window, I could see a shadow moving around inside. At this point, I started to get a bit scared. I wanted to scream out loud because the thought in the back of my head we might have an intruder nearby came to light. As I saw the shadow pass by, I quickly got my photo out and snapped a picture. As soon as I did this, however, the shadow I had seen quickly ran across the window again, and the light from the inside suddenly caught off. At this point, I wasn't exactly sure what to do. I'd never been in a situation like this before, and I was a little intimidated to try and approach and investigate myself. My dog was halfway down the yard when this happened. He started going insane now, barking like crazy and running right up to the trailer. I ran after him to try and grab him. I made it down to the trailer, where I didn't even want to get within 5 feet of right now. As I was trying to get my dog to calm down and come back with me to my dad's house, I heard and saw the click of the lock from the front door of the trailer. The door began to open slowly. At this point, I saw someone's head poke out the door. As soon as I saw this, I screamed. I picked up my dog and started sprinting all the way back to my dad's house. As I was running, I heard the front door slam open, and I heard footsteps following right behind me. I was just able to get through the door of my own home and close and lock it, not a second too soon. As soon as I did so and set my dog down, I heard something slam against the door, and the door handle started to jiggle, someone obviously trying to open it. My dad was obviously surprised. He yelled and asked what was going on. I screamed at him to call 911. As I shouted this, the banging on the door swiftly stopped, and I heard footsteps scattering from the porch. My dad called the police, and we stayed in our house with every door and window locked, as my dad questioned me about what exactly had happened. When the police arrived, I explained everything the best I could and showed them the picture I took. They sent out a search team, and wouldn't you know it, they found the guy hiding between some bushes on our property. He was arrested and put in the back of the police car. I came to find out this wasn't the first time he had been in my grandma's old trailer. He had apparently been living there for quite a while, and I just happened to see the light turn on that day. I'm guessing once he saw me outside through the window, he quickly tried to turn it off, hoping I hadn't seen him. He was put away, and hopefully he stays put away. And that was one, if not the most frightening thing that's ever happened to me, and I will never forget it. I was around 13 years old, at the shopping center with my parents. I wanted to go off on my own for a bit and wander around, looking at the various things. My parents agreed that it would be fine. After a little while, though, I was suddenly stopped by a woman in casual clothes. She told me she was an undercover cop, and she suspected me of shoplifting. Because I was young, I was quite terrified. I didn't think to ask her for ID or anything like that. Back then, I didn't even know I could question the authorities. She asked to look through my bag, and I let her, insisting I hadn't stolen anything. She asked me how old I was, who I was there with, and then she asked me something that still sends chills down my spine. "Are your parents expecting you to go home with them tonight?" I told her that of course they were. Why wouldn't they be? She then insisted I had to follow her to go and figure out this whole shoplifting thing. I was so confused and didn't know what to do. She started leading me towards the exit. By the grace of God, before we got there, we actually bumped right into my dad. He asked me what was going on, and I told him honestly. As I was explaining the situation, the woman pulled out her phone and started talking to someone on it. "Oh, you say this isn't the right girl?" Then she hung up and said, "Sorry, wrong person." She abruptly started jogging away. My dad and I stood there dumbfounded. When my mom found out about the situation, she was really unimpressed by the way this undercover cop handled the situation. She took me to center management the next day and complained to them about how I was treated by their undercover officer. "We don't employ undercover cops in this center." I have no idea what that woman had planned for me, but I thank my lucky stars every day we just so happened to run into my dad. So, a few months ago, my wife tells me this story of a girl she knows here in our neighborhood. The girl lived with her parents, or at least she used to. Anyway, one day she needed a USB for some project or something. Remembering seeing one in her father's toolbox and thinking he must have gotten it free with some drill or something, she went and grabbed it. She slipped it into her computer, hoping it worked, and was surprised to find files already on there. She clicked onto one, and what she saw next paralyzed her right in her chair. It was her dad. He was looking into a camera, fiddling with a button and trying to get something right. Behind him was her mother, his wife, sleeping on the bed. Sitting on the chair, she began to shake. Intuitively, she understood something was not right about this. When her dad went over to the bed and started taking the quilt off her mother and pulling down her underwear, she got what was happening. I'm not going to tell you everything that happened next. It's not like it was a secret or anything. Everyone in the neighborhood subsequently found out, what with it having been uploaded to a known site and making its way to other sites as well. But let's just say it was not good. I mean, it wasn't anything that would get it banned from the main ones, not on the face of things. But the fact that it had all gone on without the woman's knowledge, not to mention her consent, was appalling. Yes, you heard me. The woman, this poor girl's mother, hadn't known a thing. You see, this maniac had murdered her, and when she was in a comatose state, he went about recording everything he did to her. Now, remember, this is before the girl found out anything else. After she watched that video, she avoided her dad like the plague in the house. She thought about telling her mother what had happened on several occasions. She couldn't bring herself to do it though, and eventually she started moving out and staying with a friend until she could figure out what to do. Her emotions were all over the place. She lasted about a week before she finally told her mother what she'd found and seen. I don't know how the mother reacted, but I guess it wasn't good, because they both took off to the cops and filed a charge. Things moved fast afterward. The cops came and searched the house, found the USB, along with other hidden ones as well. They arrested him and kept him locked up for a while, asking him all questions and whatnot. That gave the woman and her daughter enough time to pack some things up and leave the house. They eventually did move back in later on. The dad came back first though, and realizing his wife had left, and the real reason his daughter had left the week before, he went into a mental rage. He thrashed the house, broke the windows, destroyed everything that was still inside, and threw it out onto the street. They reckon he'd have burnt the place down if it hadn't been for a local lad there who'd won a few bodybuilding competitions, showing up to subdue him. What a situation, the whole thing. A real tragedy. I do see them walking around, the mother and daughter. The man himself, I don't know where he is. In the mental institution, I'd guess. When I was 19, I'm a woman by the way, I was looking for a room to rent in the city I was moving to for college. It was about an hour away from my family, and I wasn't having that much luck on my own. Because of this, my mom started helping me to look for a place. She found an ad on Craigslist for a room for $300 in a house, everything included. The homeowner was a man, and he rented the additional rooms upstairs to other women while he lived down in the finished basement. The ad stated he rarely ever saw the other roommates because he had a kitchen and his own entrance downstairs, and that he preferred women staying because he'd had issues with the male roommates in the past, partying and trashing up the place. We decided to at least take a look, since it was the cheapest we could find in the area. My mom and I went to the house to view it. Decent house, nice enough neighborhood. The man opened the door and was very nice and welcoming. He was middle-aged. The kitchen and living room were furnished nicely and very clean. My mom loves to talk and get to know people, so they were engaged in some conversation while I stood there quietly and observed the place. He then said he would show me to the room he would be renting out to me. We headed towards the staircase to go up, as I thought, since he'd said on the phone my room was upstairs with the other roommates. Instead, he opened another door, and we followed behind him. This door led us down to the basement, where he opened the door to a very small room, with no closet and no windows either. He proceeded to say this would be my room, and I would be sharing the bathroom and the hallway with him. His bedroom didn't even have a door on it. I was definitely thinking, absolutely not, this is way too weird. But they were so deep in conversation that I couldn't find an opportunity to interject. He then led us to the upstairs and showed us the other rooms, of which the doors were open. He said they were currently being rented. He then started to tell us elaborate stories about the other woman in the house, some not so very nice stories, many describing drinking problems. My mom was just listening intently, but I took the time to investigate a bit further. I looked into all 3 rooms and the bathrooms as well. There was furniture inside, but there was not a single item in there that looked like it belonged to a woman. No clothes, no toiletries, nothing. There were only men's clothes in one of the closets. He had no problem with me creeping around his supposed tenants' rooms without their permission either. I then heard him tell my mom that he had some of his stuff in their closets, but they didn't mind too much. I was very confused. Why the hell would a tenant pay you for you to use their space as storage? I was feeling really uncomfortable now. I started moving them back downstairs as they talked. My mom had mentioned when we arrived that her and my dad were going on vacation the next week. I couldn't go with them because I had to work. He brought up again that I should come and stay by the next week and have dinner with him and the roomies to see if we would all get along. I said sure and hurried my mom out the door. As soon as we got in the car, I told my mom I would definitely not be living there. She was dumbfounded. I had to explain to her that not only did he lie about the room I would be in, that I was not supposed to be in the basement with him as well as sharing a bathroom with him, but he didn't even have a door. Did she also somehow not notice how no one else even lived there? She still didn't get it though, and thought I was just being paranoid. The man was so nice, and it was a cheap deal. I had to explain to my stepdad when I got home, and he told her by no means would I be living there. I tried to report the post, but by the time we got home that day, he'd already removed it. I think he planned on murdering me at that dinner while my parents were away, or planned on abducting me and holding me hostage in that basement room that had no way to escape. I really hope that guy hits a tree with his car someday or something. Often during the hot summers of the mid and late 80s, I would spend some time at my cousin's house. We both lived in rural areas, but staying with his family was considerably better than staying with mine. My cousin Clay and I had a lot of things in common and would do a lot of fun things together in the summer. We would watch scary movies on VHS, play one-on-one baseball, and go out hiking in the woods. My aunt even had a really old typewriter, and the two of us would crowd around it and write really bad, scary stories together. My uncle and aunt both worked evening jobs, so they wouldn't be there at night. My uncle was a park ranger, and my aunt was the manager of a grocery store. We had supervision during the day if we were at home. We usually weren't, except at meal times though. At night, we stayed in and watched videos or did things like that. We rarely, if ever, would go out and do anything at nighttime. The area we lived in was very safe though, so if we did, we never really had anything to worry about. I wouldn't say though that the area they lived in was an area where everyone knew each other or anything like that. In town, it would be a much different story. Whenever we went down to town, whether it was to go to the store or go to the swimming pool, everyone knew each other. But outside, at the house, it was completely different. This Saturday night, we were going to be home by ourselves for quite a long time, longer than usual even. We had a fun ride in the back of my uncle's pickup truck into town to rent some movies and get some candy and soda to prepare. It was nearly an hour ride from the town to the house in the country, and we always enjoyed being in the bed of the truck. It was still light outside when both of Clay's parents went to work, so the two of us decided to go for a quick walk down the road. I don't really remember too much about the walk itself. When we got home though, we decided to have some snacks and get started with our movie binging. Being summer, it was still light outside for quite a while. We were sitting in the living room together watching a movie when we both noticed something. A truck seemed to be coming down the road. It stopped and turned into our driveway. Clay didn't recognize this truck at all, and it didn't pull all the way up to the house either. He got up and let me know he was going to go outside and see who this was. Clay walked out the front door and onto the porch. As soon as he opened the door though, I watched the truck shoot off in reverse and begin pulling out of the driveway. It pulled back and shot down the road, heading the same direction it had come from. Clay went back inside, and we both decided it was simply someone using the driveway to turn around. We kept watching the movie and didn't pay much more mind to that incident. The night went on and the sun eventually went down. Clay and I kept watching movies, and since we were relatively young, we were getting really scared from watching them. Of course, boys our age would never admit to such a thing though. A bit later, we both began to hear some noises outside. We also saw some light shining in through the front windows of the house. We got up together and went to look outside, looking out the window. It was dark enough outside that we could notice the light shining right into the house, but we couldn't make out what the vehicle was. We did notice it seemed to have stopped in the exact place the truck from earlier had. We began talking to each other about whether or not it might be the same person. We expected the truck to pull out and turn around, much like the one from earlier did, but that didn't happen right away. In fact, nothing seemed to happen. The truck remained in place, with the light shining in through the windows. Clay was about to go out on the porch to see what was going on, but for some reason I felt the need to stop him. Something was making me feel really uneasy about all of this. I didn't know what was going on exactly, but something felt wrong to me. This was an area where people never locked their doors, whether it was during the day or even while they were sleeping, so he didn't seem to think anything was wrong. The very fact that truck was just sitting there, though, was really bugging me. I knew something was wrong. I went over to the door and locked it. He asked me what I thought was going on. I didn't know, and I told him that truthfully. I just got the feeling something was off here. We stood there for a while looking out the windows, wondering what was going to happen. Since Clay's parents were both gone, there weren't any vehicles in the driveway. It was obvious to anyone outside, though, that someone was in the home because of the lights inside. Still, the vehicle didn't do anything. It just continued to idle there. Out of nowhere, though, we heard a gunshot ring out in the night. It was definitely coming from the area around the truck. The two of us got scared, but we didn't drop to the floor like we probably should have. Instead, we ran to his parents' room and grabbed some of his dad's rifles. We heard another shot after that. Clay was feeling a lot of bravado and wanted to run outside with rifle in hand. I convinced him not to, though. As we continued hiding and discussing, we noticed something that we hadn't expected. The vehicle began shooting out of the driveway once again and drove off in a real hurry. Confused, we came out of the room. Nothing was broken, not a window or anything by a bullet. We couldn't figure out what they were shooting at or what just happened. Why had a guy put 2 shots out, which obviously did nothing, then just drove away? We checked outside and noticed something on the porch. Someone had dropped what looked to be animal trails all over the place. We didn't know what to make of this, but we knew for sure nothing like that had been there before. That guy must have put them there, but we had no idea why. We called Clay's dad, and he eventually came over to the house before his duty was over. He couldn't make any sense of this either. While he was there was a sudden phone call. It had to be about an hour after the vehicle had left. Apparently, the guy had said that next time he wouldn't miss. That was terrifying. It was just a really weird series of events. We guessed it had to be a threat against someone in particular. Clay's dad thought it was meant for him, since he was a park ranger and had arrested people for poaching and things like that, but we could never really be sure. This happened when I was younger and in college. Thusly, I went to parties a whole lot more often. My university, though quite a large one in a bustling college town, was practically set out in the middle of nowhere. While most of the parties were held on campus or in town, occasionally some really wild ones would be held off campus. Those generally had more drug use or things like that going on, though. They were safer to hold out in the middle of nowhere because you were less likely to bother neighbors and therefore much less likely to have the police called on the party for any reason. I had heard about one such party from a frat buddy of mine. He said it was being given by a friend of his in a house that his rich parents owned. They were going to be out of the country for a while, and he wanted to throw the most memorable party he possibly could. I couldn't make it as early to the party as he was leaving, so he told me he would just give me the directions so I could drive myself out there. My buddy gave me what I guess he thought were good directions, and even drew a little map as well with how to get there. Apparently, it would take at least an hour of driving, which I was really not looking forward to. I definitely was not rich, and owned an old car that I was always afraid would break down on me at some point. Still though, I told him I would be there all the same. It was already dark outside when I left, but it wasn't too late at night yet. To make matters even worse, it seemed like there was a storm fast approaching. It wasn't raining quite yet, for which I was thankful, but there was plenty of thunder and lightning in the sky. I hated driving in the rain, so I tried to drive a little faster, hopefully to get to the party before the storm fully broke. I was having a really difficult time finding a way to this place though. I knew that supposedly this guy's house was up on a hill somewhere. It was supposed to have been built with a log cabin sort of look to it. It was a vacation home that was barely even used. I guess it was so far out because when they did use it, they wanted to have a feeling of being isolated from the world. There were several times I thought I might have missed the turnoff to head in the right direction. It was hard to see the street signs when it was so dark with no lights. Also, a few times there weren't even any street signs, just roads that wandered off onto a random hill. I kept wondering if the one I'd just passed was the road I was supposed to turn on. I started to think that maybe my frat buddy was not the best guy in the world at giving directions. I finally pulled off on a random road that I was sure was not the right one. The reason I'd done this was because I'd been driving for way too long, and I was absolutely sure I'd missed the turn now. I thought I should backtrack a little bit to make sure. To do this though, I needed somewhere to turn around. I figured I would find a driveway somewhere, pull in and out real quickly. No sooner than I'd begun driving on that hill, the rain finally began to pour down, and it began pouring hard as well. Great. That was just what I needed to happen. It was already dark and hard to see on this road, but it became nearly impossible to see anything after that. My headlights were just as much of a hindrance as they were helpful. I kept on driving and driving down this small road, not coming upon any driveways or homes at all. At some point, the road was becoming so small that it might be impossible to make a three-point turnabout even. That was when I noticed something just up ahead of me. There was a gate blocking the road. I had no choice but to stop at this gate. However, looking at this road, it looked like it widened just enough right before the gate itself, so I could make an effort to turn around. Right then, though, I was suddenly startled by a pounding at my window. I turned and saw a man standing outside my car door in the rain. He was wearing a raincoat and carrying a flashlight as well. I couldn't see much of him because he was shining his light right in my eyes. "Hey, you're not supposed to be here," he yelled at me. "Get the hell out of here!" I kept trying to maneuver my car around, and now it was even more difficult with him blocking the way. He just kept screaming at me to get out. He kept pounding his fist on the window as well. I thought that was bad, but when I had the car half turned around, my headlight shined into the trees on the side of the road. I could see two more people in raincoats, hiding amongst them. They didn't look very pleased, and I was sure they were carrying guns as well. That set my panic up much higher. The man kept yelling, and believe me, I was trying. It wasn't easy though. I was so scared I didn't care if I hit the guy or not. When I got my car around as much as I could, I turned the wheel as sharply as I could and hit the gas. It took a moment, likely because the dirt road was so wet, but I was finally able to pull away from this scary man and his friends. I drove off of that road as quickly as I could. When I got back to the main road, I was thankful as I to be off that hill. I decided to just skip the party and head back to campus where I was sure I would be safe. My frat buddy wondered, of course, why I'd never made it. I told him what happened, but he didn't seem to believe me for whatever reason. He thought I'd just decided not to go and was making up excuses. I've told the story several times in his presence, but he never seems to believe me. A little backstory leading up to this meeting. I grew up in a shady area and would rarely leave home after 7 or 8 p.m. as it was considered quite dangerous. Going into high school, I got a pit bull for a pet. He was a gentle giant who loved everyone and everything. He had some protection work training before he joined our family, but as he was getting older, he had to retire, and so I took him home with me. Anyways, on to the backstory. I was at this time 17, short, blonde, and very aware of my size. Having a big scary dog though, I finally felt safe walking alone. That very night I set out to take a longer walk, as my dog, let's call him Meatball, needed to run off some extra energy. I took him out to the woods near my home, and we walked along a gravel path that was partly lit. It was around 11 p.m. and quite dark outside. As we walked, I became very aware of the fact there wasn't really anyone else around. We walked for a good 10 to 15 minutes before suddenly a man appeared behind us. We continued to walk onward, not really minding, until I started to notice he was taking all the same turns as me. I sped up, feeling my heart beating in my chest. Meatball, who normally just spent his time sniffing at the end of the leash, now appeared very aware of the situation as well. He slowed down and stuck close to my leg, with a full focus on this man. I started turning at every turn I could, and the man followed us down every single one, even though we were now obviously walking in circles. He started to get closer and closer to us, and I was now certain he was trying to catch up to me. I remembered something my father once told us in this moment. Never let someone follow you, as you're most vulnerable from behind. If you get into a situation where you can force your stalker to pass you by, do so. I stopped in place and grabbed onto Meatball's leash. I leaned back in the leash, acting as if I had to pull my entire body weight and holding him back. Now, I was very aware at this point in my life that I was small and looked weak as well. My father is an old veteran though, and he did teach me a few tricks of fighting before I could even walk. I was a lot stronger than I looked. I called out, trying to sound as naive as I could, hoping that if I did have to fight, I would be able to surprise him with my strength. "Excuse me, my dog really doesn't like people and I can't hold him back when he lunges. If I step to the side, you could pass us by and I wouldn't have to hold him back so much." As soon as I said this, Meatball started barking, growling, and snapping towards the man, who now stopped and looked me up and down. He stared at Meatball for a moment, then turned around and walked back the way he came, not even saying a single word to me. He left quickly after. I called my parents and asked them to meet up with me, as I now realized he could easily hide anywhere on our walk back. My dad showed up only a few minutes later, baseball bat in hand. Nothing really happened because it didn't get the chance to, but after being followed by this man at every turn I took for at least 35 minutes, I know this could have ended really badly had I not had Meatball or my dad close by. It was Halloween. My mom and dad had gone to an adult Halloween party at their friend's house and left me, a 14-year-old male, and my sister home alone to hand out candy to the neighborhood kids. We lived on a small farm surrounded by other small farms, and our Halloweens were pretty mellow. My sister was 12 and had finally gotten to the age where she thought trick-or-treating and dressing up was embarrassing. I just liked staying home and playing video games with my friends anyway, so I didn't usually go out on Halloween either. The only issue that night was my parents had forgotten to get candy altogether, so they told us to just hand out whatever fruits or pretzels we had lying around in the kitchen. That was so embarrassing for me, having to give kids something they didn't want on the one night of the year they were supposed to be getting candy. I wasn't too worried about it, given that not many kids lived in our area though, so we figured we wouldn't have to answer the door much, if at all. We handed out the first batch of apples to the disappointed kids, and by 11 p.m., we assumed we were already done for the night. Then, though, came another knock at the door. It was quite late now, and I didn't really want to answer the door again. I figured it was just some little kids, though, and I didn't want to be rude and ignore them when they could all see that the lights were on inside. I got to the door and pulled it open, and was shocked to see 4 very tall guys standing there, all in masks, holding their pillowcases open, seemingly expecting candy. Sorry guys, we don't have anything. We've been handing out apples to the kids all night. I mean, I got some pretzels if you want some." The tallest one tilted his head at me, almost like he was confused by what I was saying. None of them actually spoke though. I didn't really know what else to do, so I started to close the door on them. When I was about to shut it all the way though, one of the guys stuck his shoe in between the door and the door frame, preventing me from closing it. I opened the door again to ask him what his problem was, but instead he and his friends just shoved their way inside. I yelled for my sister to run and hide, before being roughly shoved to the ground. One of the intruders pulled a bat out from under his robe and said in a low, deep voice, "We didn't come for your candy." I managed to get on my hands and knees before being kicked hard in the stomach. That knocked me to the ground once again. I tried screaming, but the thing about living on a farm with more land between you and your neighbors than the average neighborhood is composed of is that no one is going to hear you when you scream for help. I kept screaming anyways, though. "It's Halloween, buddy. You really think anyone's gonna think twice about a kid screaming?" This made the rest of them laugh as the man continued taunting me. "Look, I don't know what you want, but I can give you money if you just leave." I expected a response, but instead he just laughed at my shaking voice. In a baby talk voice, one of the guys leaned in. "Oh look, the little baby's scared. Where's daddy to save you when you need him?" I felt a stinging in my side as the guy with the bat swung it directly into my ribs. I was trying to listen to the voices to figure out how old they were, and from what I could gather, they seemed to be young enough to be teenagers. There were a lot of thoughts going through my mind in that moment. I crawled to the corner of the room in pain as they spoke to each other about what rooms they would go in and what they were going to take. One of the guys took me outside, while the others looked around the house for whatever it was they wanted. I looked up and saw my sister on the roof, hiding outside her window from a man I could see had just entered her room. The guy that took me outside had me by the collar of my shirt and was leading me toward the barn. He opened the door to the pig pen and pushed me inside, threatening me with the bat. He made me roll around in the mud and filth as he forced me to oink. I was terrified, exhausted, confused, embarrassed, and felt completely humiliated at what I was being forced to do. The guy was laughing the whole time, too. He told me to get up and led me out of the barn and back into the house to show the rest of his friends what he'd done to me. They only just joined in the torment. They made me drink toilet water, eat trash from the trash can, and other things I can't even speak of as they pulled me around. The whole time, I was just hoping they wouldn't find my sister. The strange thing is, they hadn't even mentioned her once. They took me to my room and began taking turns punching me. I had no idea what I'd done to deserve this horrible beating and torture I was being put through. I blacked out many times. 10 minutes into the beating, I heard one of them finally ask where my sister was. They told me that they wanted to have some fun with her, and they'd stop hurting me if I told them. That was the moment I stopped talking completely.
I was not letting them near my sister. They asked me again, spitting in my face. Each time I refused to talk. There was nothing they could do to me that would get me to give her up. Eventually, they tied me to a chair in the kitchen and exited the house after thoroughly trashing the place. I must have blacked out again, because when I woke up, I was in the hospital, attached to a bunch of machines. My mom was crying when she noticed me awake and took her time to tell me exactly what happened. It turns out the girl I had just broken up with the week before asked her brother to scare me as revenge for hurting her. I guess she hadn't expected he and his friends to take it to the extent they did that night. They just got caught up in it, as disgusting as that sounds. They were all soon arrested, but only the brother was actually sentenced to jail time. He received 5 years for aggravated assault and home invasion charges. The other guys got probation as a plea deal for ratting him out. I'm still in a lot of pain, since this happened less than a year ago. I guess there's one thing I'd like to tell kids answering the door for Halloween though, when their parents aren't home. Always make sure to check outside before you open the door. It had just gone past the transition of New Year's 2022 into the first day of 2023. It was about 2 or 3 a.m. or so. Me and my 2 best friends, who we'll call Lena and Maria, had taken a 2-hour train to a town called Barnsley in the UK. I had started dating a boy there recently, and my friends were excited to meet him. We were all 18 and had decided to go clubbing with my boyfriend and his friends. When Lena started to feel tired around 2 or 3 a.m. though, me, her, and Maria made our way to a bus stop. Of course, it was too late to get on one, but we were talking about calling a taxi. My boyfriend was very intoxicated at this point, so I told him he didn't have to stay with us. We left him behind at the club. Suddenly, as we were talking though, a man dressed in all black appeared from behind the bus stop. "Heard you needed a free ride," he said with a strong accent that I couldn't quite pinpoint. Already tired and a bit intoxicated ourselves, the idea seemed good at first. We believed the man had good intentions. He asked us where we were staying, and we stupidly told him. That was when Maria piped up and politely said, "I'm sorry, but in this day and age, girls can't trust people and get into strange cars." The man looked quite offended and showed us his wedding ring, which looked very cheap and fake even at a first glance. "Come on, I'm a married man. I won't rape and murder you like Ted Bundy or something." The way he said it with such an excited tone made my heart drop. My friend seemed to feel similarly, as she immediately tried to ring up the taxi company. The taxi wouldn't arrive for at least 10 minutes though. The man sat right down next to me at the bus stop, asking me if I was in a relationship and for my age. This man must have been about 40 years old. "My wife works night shifts, you see, and I'm so lonely. I've come out tonight looking for a new woman to bag." I comforted him awkwardly, telling him I'd talk to him while we waited for the taxi. He told us about his intentions if we didn't get in the car with him. He told us he just wanted to rant to us all in his car. Before we could even have the opportunity to decline, he got up and opened the back door. Maria looked at me anxiously and whispered, "What do we do if he pulls out a weapon?" Anxiety came over me. I took a few steps back in bewilderment and began spam calling my boyfriend and his friends at the club. None of them picked up though. The man turned his car lights off, and we heard him locking the doors before yelling us over again. Thankfully, the taxi arrived not long after. We all jumped in and called the police, while telling the man in the taxi to turn back around. We could see the same man sat waiting in his car by the bus stop, now with his headlights back on, and waiting for the next vulnerable and drunk young girls to arrive. I was just driving home from a morning shift
and was about 1 kilometer away from home when all of a sudden a guy jumped out onto the road in front of me, waving his arms and screaming for me to stop. I slammed on the brakes to try and avoid hitting him, and he ran right into my window. I've had similar things happen before when people needed help after an accident, so I assumed that was what this must be. I rolled down the window to hear what he was saying, but to my surprise, the guy instead said, "Please help me, I'm being a ass, get me out of here!" Being the soft person I am, I simply said, "Sure, hop in, man." Now, I spend a lot of time in my car. My front passenger seat is basically my office and completely covered in not even thinking. I told him to get in the back. This was lucky. This stranger was now in my back seat. I asked him some questions. "You want me to take you to the police station? What can I do for you?" He said yes. I pulled a U-turn and started heading to our nearest cop shop. Luckily, it was only about 6 kilometers away. At this point, I still thought this guy had legitimately been mugged or something, so I asked him a bit more about what was going on. "There's people after me. See, there's one there, hiding in the bushes, and another one right there, on the side of the road. Up in that tree, right there." There was obviously no one in either the bushes or the trees. I thought to myself. I've just picked up a person in the middle of a psychotic break, having gang-stalking delusions. "Okay, mate, let's get you to the police station and get you sorted out," I said, trying to sound reassuring and calming. He seemed very responsive and thanked me profusely. "The police station's just out on the main road. It'll only take us a minute to get there, so just relax, alright? I've never wanted a cop car to appear in my rearview mirror so much in my life." There were only 2 kilometers to go. We were driving in silence when suddenly he snapped his head to the side and looked right at me. He started saying in this super deep growl, "You're not taking me to the police station, are you?" "Yes, sir, I sure am. We're almost there. Just hang on now." "You're one of them. This was the whole plan, wasn't it? I'm getting chased and you just happened to show up in that second. Where are you taking me? Let me out right now!" He started thrashing around in my back seat, hitting the back of my head and flailing wildly. Just then, we came around a curve, and there was the police station. "Come on, man, look, it's right there. We're turning in right now." I turned in, and he started to calm down. He said thank you and ran inside as soon as I parked. I gave him a few minutes to tell his story to the cops, then went inside and told the desk sergeant what actually happened, just to give him a bit more context. It was so crazy, and it literally happened just 10 minutes ago. Well, this is probably the worst thing that happened to me in my life. It happened to me when I was simply going out for a walk. I live out in the mountains in a very nice house, and I enjoyed very much taking walks in the wilderness. On this day, I got some water and a little food for a snack in my bag, and set out to go for a walk in the woods. Now, I've done this many times before, so it's very hard to explain what happened. To this day, I still can't even quite find the words to explain it. I was very familiar with the territory I was in. I don't know how this happened, but somehow I took a wrong turn somewhere. I really had absolutely no memory of how this occurred, but I began to notice the wilderness was a lot different than what I'd noticed before. It didn't take me too long to realize I'd gone the completely wrong way. I turned around and tried to backtrack to the area I was familiar with, but turning around and backtracking didn't work. If anything, it made things a lot more difficult for me. Even when I was going back over what I thought was the area I'd previously gone through, I wasn't sure that I really was. Nothing looked familiar, and I became very worried I'd made several wrong turns since then. It didn't take long for me to admit to myself I was completely lost, and this was a very bad place to be lost in. With the mountains and forests and everything in this area, getting lost could be a real death sentence.
I wasn't too worried at first though. I hadn't been out for a very long time, and I felt I could still quickly find my way back to an area I was familiar with. As time went on though, I found I was not going to be finding my way back home so quickly. I think the more I tried to zone in and find an area I was familiar with, the more I found myself getting lost. As the day got later and later, and I kept not recognizing a single thing, I really began to worry. The biggest fear was when it got dark outside. Despite having no idea where I was already, I knew there would be for sure no way I was going to find my way home in the dark. I didn't have a flashlight on me either, and it would be difficult to see much of anything. As it got darker, I knew I would have to try and settle down for the night. I tried to find some place that would be safe and warm, but that was obviously hard to do as well. I just found the best place I could and realized I would have to hunker down. This was going to be quite a horrible night, and it really was. Being cold and alone and lost was truly terrifying. I had never had to sleep on the ground before like this. Mostly, I was stuck thinking about how I would be able to get home the next day. I slept very poorly that night, as one might expect. Either way, I was happy to be able to have light again in the morning. I set out, hoping I would be able to find my way to somewhere, anywhere, even a simple road or path. This quickly proved that it was not going to be a winning strategy for me. The second day out in the woods turned out a lot like the first one. Couldn't find anything familiar and couldn't find any signs of civilization. Also, the meager water I had brought with me was mostly gone by now. I knew I would have to find a creek just to not die of dehydration. Just like the first day, it began getting dark before I could do much of anything. For a second time, the night was coming down, and I hadn't made any headway getting out of these mountains. I had to find another place to try and hunker down and keep warm for the night. Like the previous one, I knew it was going to be rather cold, so I knew I was in for something that was not going to be fun. There was something different about the second night than the first one though. Although I'd slept badly the first night, it was mostly because of the weather and discomfort. The second night was different. I kept on hearing these sounds, like someone or something was out in the woods with me. I wasn't sure how to tell if it was a person or an animal. I was just a hiker, not a hunter or anyone with that sort of knowledge. Whatever this was though, it seemed like it was sticking around my area for quite a long time. Being so dark though, I was not able to see anything, and I didn't want to call out and reveal my position. I figured if it was someone who could have helped me, they would have known I was there already. At some point, due to the sheer tiredness, I must have dozed off. After that, I slept a lot more soundly than I had the night before. When I finally woke up, I noticed the sun had been up for quite a while. At first, I was relieved to have slept well, but that didn't last long at all. When I got up, I noticed there were some twigs arranged in a formation on the ground, in such a way they spelled out the letter X. That couldn't have been by chance, and an animal wouldn't have done that either. It was a neat letter X that I knew hadn't been there the night before. At that point, I was already dried out from not having any water left over, and although I'd slept deeply, I was still pretty tired. I was worried about how much longer I'd survive out here on my own. The last thing I needed was some strange or crazy person following me. On the third day, I tried even harder to try and find my way out of the area. I wasn't too worried as long as there was light outside. It was incredibly bright out today, and I hadn't seen anyone in the woods yet. I also didn't hear those sounds out with me. After a while, I eventually found a small stream. I was able to get some water to drink, which was the best thing at the moment. I was hungry, but there wasn't much I could do about that. The stream led to a creek, but that didn't help me very much. It didn't seem like I was any closer to finding my way out, and I didn't find my way out again that day. Once again, I had to sleep in the woods, only this time I was much more terrified than I had been before. Despite being scared though, I still managed to drift off. I think not having had any food probably made it a lot easier. I woke up the next morning to something even more terrifying than the X from the previous night. Not far from where I was sleeping, a slaughtered rodent of some sort was lying on the ground. Scrawled in the dirt was a single word: leave. I got up quickly that morning and set off again, determined more than ever to get myself back to safety. I was completely terrified at that point. Obviously, someone didn't want me out there, no more than I wanted to be out there myself. Sometime in what I figured was the afternoon, I was in an open area on the side of a hill. That was when I saw someone emerge from the trees. I thought back to the X, to the rodent, and the message. I was about to leave and run off before I heard them call out my name. Then I heard them yell to someone else. I'm glad I didn't just run off, because it turns out a search party had been put together to come and rescue me. They didn't have the highest hopes because I'd been gone for so long, and were actually pretty surprised when they found me alive and kicking. Fortunately, they brought along some food and water as well, so I was able to fill up on that. I told them about the scary thing I had experienced, but most of them seemed to think I was just delirious from not having eaten in a day. I knew better than that, however. I knew there was someone out there who didn't want me to be out there with them. I just hoped they were happy as I was when I finally left.
While everyone else was getting drunk and laid, I was stuck at my parents' suburban home studying for the CATs. My parents spent their whole lives working high-paying jobs, and as a result were able to afford a 3-story mansion. They also filled it with lavish art, decor, and furniture. Recently, my father decided to even buy a $15,000 grand piano just because it looked cool. I had moved out of state 5 years before, and so had to stay in the scarcely furnished guest room on the 3rd floor at the end of the hallway. It was 7 p.m., and the sun was beginning to set now. My parents were off attending the annual Rotary Club auction and soon headed out on their way. I returned to my books and continued studying. I had just finished reading the chapter about nucleus mitosis and glanced at the digital clock by the bedside. It was around 9 p.m. or so, and it was now pitch black outside and everywhere else in the house pretty much. I rolled my chair over to the door and glanced down the hallway. It was too dark to see anything. Realizing I had been studying for the past 6 hours or so, I decided to call it a night and collapsed onto my bed. As I continued to lay down for a bit, I looked at the clock again and saw it was now around 10. My parents were probably home by now. Finally, I started to fall asleep. I was awoken soon after to another sound. This time, however, it was Mozart's Lacrimosa playing on the grand piano downstairs. Was my dad seriously practicing piano right now? I had to admit, though, he was playing very well. I pulled the blanket over my head and tried to fall back asleep. Something was wrong, though. I realized that no one in my family really knew how to play the piano that well. My dad had just bought it to piss my mom off. The piano continued to play, and I had the sudden urge to go downstairs and see what was going on. Upon my realization, though, I was frozen and the fear kept me from doing so. Instead, I reached for the home phone and dialed my dad's cell phone number. He answered pretty much right away. "Hey, Dad? What's up? Where are you guys? Are you home? We're on the ferry right now." The piano playing came to an abrupt stop as soon as he said that. I remained silent, and my heart started skipping beats. My dad called my name. My voice was shaking. Yeah, Dad? Who's that on the other line?" I heard the piano stool screech against the marble floor through the phone line. "Dad, there's someone in the house." All of a sudden, I heard some heavy sprinting up the stairs and down the hallway. I jumped off the bed and slammed the door to my room closed. I pushed my body up against it. My dad's voice was yelling over the phone, demanding me to hang up and call the police right now.
I felt something heavy slam against the door from the outside and heard heavy breathing through it. After about 10 seconds, everything was silent once again. After a few more minutes, from the other side of the door, I heard the man's voice calmly saying something that sent chills down my neck. My wife was a doctor once. She never had time for me. The footsteps slowly walked away from my door, and I heard the front door open and shut. I was scared stiff and decided not to move away from my spot against the door. It felt like hours before my parents and the police showed up. The police fully searched the house and discovered the downstairs piano room door had its locks removed. They were lying outside, severely rusted. The next day, I traded in my medical books and changed my major to civil engineering.
Names changed for privacy. I, 23 and female, recently moved to Florida from Pennsylvania for a job. All of my family and friends are still in Pennsylvania though, so I live by myself here, which can get pretty spooky. My second week here, I met my next door neighbor, Eddie. He seemed like a relatively normal guy, in his 70s, very quiet and very polite as well. One day, they turned the water off in the whole complex for repairs without notice. I went over to ask if his was off too. He answered the door and proceeded to talk to me for about half an hour. I obliged because I hadn't seen him get any visitors, and I assumed he was quite lonely. Toward the end of the conversation, it started to get a bit creepy though. He said that he was on his balcony one day, watching the neighbor girl across the way through her window as she took some bikini pics. He said, "If I had daughters, I'd be constantly scared they're doing that. You don't scare your dad like that, do you?" It put a bad taste in my mouth, but I attributed it to his loneliness. A few days later, a looming shadow appeared in front of me, and I saw him briefly looking in through my window. To my knowledge, he only had an ex-wife. No kids, no partner, no family to my knowledge. Fast forward a few weekends. My partner came to visit me, and we were out all day at the flea market. I came back to a note at my door from him, saying I'd had a package delivered and he'd picked it up for me. My partner Scott went to the bathroom, and I went next door to retrieve my package. I knocked and there was no answer. Later though, he came to my door in the shortest robe I'd ever seen, and said he had been in the shower. I just said, "Oh, okay, thanks for picking up my package." Before I could close the door, he mentioned that we didn't need to be quiet, and to let us know if he was making too much noise. Fast forward 2-ish weeks. I get home from work. The people from my apartment's office were up on my landing in front of my door, which I assumed was for the palmetto bug I reported. I didn't understand why it took all 3 of them though. I walked up the stairs and they asked me when the last time I'd seen Eddie was. I told them about the encounter 2 weeks prior and I entered my apartment. A few minutes later, they knocked on my door and asked me if the man on the scan of an ID was my neighbor, to which I confirmed. After that, I went to the 7-Eleven to pick up some ice. When I returned, there were 2 police cars in the parking lot. I approached the stairs and everyone on the landing was looking at me. When I got up to my area, the officer asked me when the last time I'd seen Eddie was. I reiterated my previous answer. I went back in my apartment and started my nightly cleaning. Around 10 minutes later, a different cop knocked and asked me the same question, to which I obliged. I was the last person to report seeing him. While the officer was asking me questions, the apartment staff were talking to another cop. I overheard them saying, "Oh, he's in there, and he's all melty." Apparently, my neighbor had died, likely a week or 2 ago. He was so decomposed he'd been leaking into the apartment downstairs. He must have not had anyone check in on him in that whole time. That's one of my worst fears. I felt bad for not checking in on him because I hadn't seen him in a while, but I just attributed it to opposite schedules, as I work Monday through Friday 8 to 5. The creepiest part is I'd been hearing sounds from that apartment, some sort of knocking as if someone was living there. I don't know if that was him trying to get help or what. I found out that was also likely the root of my bedroom palmetto bug problem, since I'm particular about keeping my apartment clean. I've slept on my couch the past week, and it's hard living there alone at night now. This just happened about 15 minutes ago and was one of the weirdest encounters I've ever had. My family and I, 22 and female, were sitting in our living room watching some TV after dinner. All of a sudden, there was an unexpected knock at the front door. I went to open it and saw there were 3 young teens that I didn't know standing outside. They all appeared to be sophomores in high school. They told me that these weird guys were following them, and they needed to look like they knew someone who was in this home. I told them immediately to come inside, to evade the people stalking them. The teens told me that 3 men had been following them as they walked about a mile from a gas station nearby to my neighborhood. I went outside to try and see if I could see these people, and sure enough, as I looked closer, I could see them just down the street a little ways. When I stepped outside, they yelled out to me, "Lacey, is that you?" I didn't answer. I went back inside and asked if any of the girls seeking refuge were named Lacey. None were. My dad went outside to tell them to move along. They got super mouthy and rude, and eventually they did walk up the street and out of sight. We thought that that would be the end of it. However, we noticed them come skulking back a few minutes later. I opened the door and yelled for them to leave right now, but they started screaming at me that they wouldn't be going anywhere. My dad went back outside. A neighbor also heard the yelling and came out to see what was happening. With the threat of 2 grown men approaching them, the guys finally left, not without some additional lip though. I then drove the 3 teens back to one of their houses so they could evade these guys and get back home safely. Something was really weird about the interactions with those men. I don't know what they were looking to do or if they were just looking for some trouble, but something about them did not sit right with me. I'm just glad those 3 teens decided to come to my house and nothing bad happened to them. When I was a police officer, a big part of my job was responding to suicides on the train tracks. People would regularly stand or throw themselves in front of trains to end their own lives. It was often my job to find the body, search for the body's ID, and pick all the parts up, place them all in a body bag, and ready them to be taken to the morgue. I've lost count of how many of these types of jobs I attended. Most of the time, the impact of the train obliterated them, and I was simply picking up a few pieces of flesh that were indistinguishable from one another. No matter how gruesome each one was, eventually they all started to kind of blend into one memory in my mind. Maybe a coping mechanism for how horrific that was. Except for one. I was working the night shift and got a call on my radio. About 3 a.m., a person had been struck by a train. My team and I were all sitting in the office at the time, so as soon as the call came in, we all jumped up and rushed into the police van. We drove on the dark, quiet roads of London to the train station. None of us said a word to each other the entire way. It was completely silent. We were all too busy thinking about what horrible sight we were going to witness, what we were going to see. Once we arrived at the station, I saw the fire brigade there, as well as the London ambulance service. Not many people realize it's us police officers that have to pick up after these sorts of things. Yeah, it's us, unfortunately. Once the power on the train tracks was off, I walked onto the tracks ahead of my team, with my torch at the ready to look for the body. I remember it being freezing cold and silent. The only noise was my feet hitting the rubble on the train tracks. After a long walk in the pitch black, I saw the body. I approached to get a closer look, and what I saw has stayed with me ever since. I don't think the memory will ever leave me. The man's eyes were staring right into my soul. His body was not completely obliterated like most of the jobs I'd been to before. Instead, the man's head had been cleanly serviced and was placed perfectly on the rail tracks where it landed. It was an odd sight. At this point, I waved the rest of my team over. We all kitted up with the correct equipment to do the body recovery. We were all there in the pitch black in our white bodysuits picking up the remains. I was the one who had to pick his head up by his hair and place it with the rest in the body bag. It was just staring into my eyes while I was doing so. Once the body was in the body bag, 4 of us carried the bag on the tracks to get the body out of the station. While we were carrying this dead weight, our arms started to get real tired, so I suggested to the team we all swap sides to give one of our arms a break. As we gently placed the body bag down, laughter started to come from inside of it. A really high-pitched, slow laugh. The kind of laugh that was laughing right at you. Chills went down my spine. I was so frightened that not only was I speechless, but I was completely frozen. We all stopped and looked at each other. I just picked up this man's disfigured head. How could he possibly be alive? How could he be laughing at us? I could see fear on my colleagues' faces as well. Nobody knew what to do. Eventually, we opened up the body bag. Whichever officer had searched the actual body hadn't seen that the man's phone was inside his jacket pocket. The man had received a call from an unknown number, and it just so happened that his ringtone was a snippet of his own laughter. That laughter still stays with me to this day. When I was a child, around 10 and a female, my parents ran a construction business. They had several employees on the payroll at any given time, mostly to drive gravel or cement trucks for them. My dad is a kind but naive man who often hired friends of friends who were down on their luck to give them a chance to get back on their feet, so to speak. It never worked out well, because my dad somehow always gets linked up with the scroungiest people. They had a lot of creeps over the years, but I think the worst one might have been Ben. Ben was a friend of my dad's dad, who also worked for us for a time. Ben supposedly had an old work injury that made it difficult for him to work any job where he had to be on his feet all day. My dad's dad begged my dad to give him a job as a driver, and my dad finally agreed. From the very day we met him, though, Ben made my mom extremely uncomfortable. He just had one of those weird vibes that you can't really explain unless you're there. Everybody, except for my dad, picked up on it. Like I said, my dad is extremely naive. My mom wouldn't let me and my younger sister be around him for any length of time. We were homeschooled at the time, and my mom worked in the office, so we were around quite a bit. She kept telling my dad over and over we should let him go, but my dad refused to because he didn't have any legitimate reason to fire him. This is the weird part. Whenever my sister or I were at the office on a slow day, my dad's dad would always try to get us to come over and sit with him and Ben. He would always ask us, "Don't you want to go for a ride with us in the big truck?" Ben himself would never talk to us. He just let my dad's dad handle all the speaking. We were shy kids, so we never agreed to it, but he was pretty persistent. It reached the point where it was literally every single time he saw us there. My sister and I would take turns hiding in the bathroom just so we didn't have to be around them. They'd always do it when my mom was out of the room too, and they'd immediately back off whenever she came back in. My dad was never around when it happened, and I don't think he believed it at all. I mean, who wants to believe that about your own father and his friend? My mom eventually had enough though, and gave my dad an ultimatum for Ben to go. A few years later, we found out that Ben had taken a young girl. My dad's dad had another friend with a daughter around my age, out for a ride in the truck as they had mentioned before, and he molested her. My dad's dad was enabling him the whole time, trying to find him more victims. I shudder to think what would have happened if my mom hadn't been looking out for us. I grew up in the same house for my entire childhood. My parents had bought it before I was born, and they lived in it all the way until they passed away. Right now, my siblings and I all share ownership of the house, although no one currently resides in it. I had my own bedroom growing up too. It was great to never have to share a room with someone else. Sometimes though, it could be a little bit scary to have one's own room, and this story was the scariest thing that ever happened to me in that room. I do remember though that although I always had my own bedroom, I changed rooms with my younger sister at some point. My parents didn't tell us why they were making the change at that time. On occasion, I would get a really uneasy feeling when I was alone in this newer room. It would come out of nowhere and just linger on me for a bit. It wasn't ever anything serious though. When I was 16 years old, I was laying in bed reading. When I got too tired to do any more, I turned the lights off and tried to get to sleep. When I did this, however, that uneasy feeling I would sometimes get came back in full force. For some reason, I had this desire to go and open up my closet door and check in there before going back to bed. It was a little nighttime ritual I had not done in a long time. Normally after I did so, though, I would drift off to sleep with no problem. Obviously, nothing was in the closet when I checked. I went back to bed and turned my lamp off. I laid on my side, which is how I usually slept, facing the window, which looked out into the backyard of the house. I immediately jumped out of bed and screamed as loud as I could. There was someone standing in the backyard, peering in through my window. I couldn't make them out perfectly, but I could see the top half of a human face from the nose up. Whoever this was, they were looking right at me. I switched on my lamp, but by the time my eyes adjusted, the man was already gone out of sight. My mom and dad both came running into the room, asking me what was wrong. I explained what happened to them, and they almost seemed relieved. My dad told my mom that he would go and check out the backyard just to be sure. I wasn't sure what he meant by that. Finally, my mom told me why it was she had switched rooms with my younger sister. Apparently, for a long period of time, my younger sister had complained about some guy watching her from the window. She never saw his full face, just the top half of it, but she always knew he was looking at her. Whenever my dad would go out and check the backyard, though, there would never be anyone there. My parents had chalked the experience up to my younger sister's imagination. They thought if they switched bedrooms, the bedroom I was previously in was on the second floor, that my younger sister would stop imagining things. After switching, she never mentioned a person looking into her window ever again. That was years and years before this happened, and because of that, my parents eventually forgot about it. My dad came back and confirmed there was no one in the backyard. They asked me if my younger sister had ever told me about this before, and I told them she had not. I had never even suspected such a thing of happening. They seemed a bit doubtful, but also freaked out that this had happened again. When I asked my younger sister about this later, she definitely remembered it. She had been much younger when it had happened, but that face was still burned in her memory. I never saw that person again after, and we're not entirely sure what was going on in our backyard. When I was in high school, I lived in an apartment complex in Calabasas, California. It's where all the kids lived that weren't filthy rich, that went to Calabasas High School or Agoura High School. I became friends with most of the kids in that complex. We would play basketball some days and on the weekends break into empty apartments and throw some parties. At one particular party, I was hanging out with a group I didn't know quite so well. It was 5 other guys and 1 single girl. We were all smoking and drinking. when I saw the other guys go into a room while the girl was just standing in the kitchen drinking a beer. I had to go to the bathroom in that moment, but as I was walking by, I overheard the guys talking. "So when are we gonna rear this shit?" one of them said. Another guy said, "Yeah, we're gonna run a train on her all night." Now, in high school, I was already a pretty big kid. When I heard them casually talking about that kind of stuff, I walked right up to them to confront them. "Guys, you aren't going to be doing a thing while I'm around." To my surprise, instead of being surprised I'd heard them or something, they immediately tried to convince me to join in on attacking her. "Come on, it might be fun. Maybe she'll get into it." I left the room feeling really grossed out. I walked over to the girl without informing the guys and told her what they'd been talking about. I said she should probably head home and the party was over. She left right away and thanked me, and I left shortly after as well. I didn't want to have anything else to do with those guys. The kicker to this story is, that boy that said let's run a train on her and the one that suggested they attack her, I later found out from a mutual friend that they actually did attack and kill a girl in college. They even got chased in a police chase and crashed the car into the median. The world can be a real scary place for women. I think about this a lot more now that I'm raising a daughter myself. My partner and I used to go for late-night McDonald's runs quite frequently, especially since the one in my college town was open 24 hours a day. Probably not the healthiest pastime, but hey, when you're concentrating on finals, or let's be honest, putting projects off until the very last minute, and the dining hall's closed, you'll either scrounge around for any crumbs you can find or go for some fast food to refuel yourself for that all-nighter. Anyway, it was around 1 a.m. He and I entered the restaurant. Neither of us had figured out the kiosks yet, so we went to the line at the counter to order. Right away, we noticed something was off though. We couldn't quite explain what it was, but the general air of the place just didn't feel quite normal. There was a tense atmosphere that had thickened the air and caused us to have a bit of anxiety. As I got to the counter to order my chicken nuggets and shake, the employee looked really nervous. She kept glancing over at the back of the restaurant as if something was constantly drawing her attention. After taking my order, she nervously excused herself and all but rushed out of the restaurant, leaving my partner and I very confused. An equally wired man came to take my partner's order. After asking him how his night was going to try and make some small talk, he said this without even breaking eye contact. It's a shit show, man. I'm thinking of shooting my brains out." We didn't know how to respond, so we just didn't. He said it with such dead seriousness that there was no way it could be some kind of dark humor joke. All that came out of my mouth as I handed him my card was a surprised, "Oh!" I glanced down at his name tag, and it simply read manager. Well, that was a twist. I guess everyone was having a really rough shift. We didn't want to add to that, so we were just going to grab our orders and go real quick. And that's when the girl from before came back in. She froze as a man got up from one of the back tables of the restaurant and seemed to walk straight for her. Right at the last second, as she turned to walk out again, the man changed course and sprinted for the bathrooms. I went to ask the girl if she was okay and if something was wrong here, but she simply said in a very quiet voice, "Sorry, not now." She headed out to the back kitchen. My partner and I decided it would be best to just get the hell out of here, nuggets or no nuggets. Especially before either that manager came back or that strange man came out of the restroom. Thankfully, our orders came up only moments later, so we grabbed them and ran back out of the McDonald's. At this point, the neon glow of the arches seemed like a warning rather than a welcome. Not to sound cliche, but it was just really creepy in there, and I wanted no part of any of that for that night. My partner and I compared notes as we headed back.
He said he'd noticed that man that ran to the bathroom making strange faces at the girl as she took my order, explaining some of her strange behavior. We had no idea about the manager though. We chalked it up to the stress of dealing with a harassment case on the night shift or something, or maybe just general mounting depression coming to the surface. I hope that girl made it through the night okay without losing her sanity, and the strange guy left her alone. It's been a while since I've been to McDonald's at 1 a.m., and I'm nervous about going again anytime soon. My wife and I spent years searching for a starter home. Finding the right home can be a difficult process in itself, but there were the added factors of being on an extremely tight budget and only qualifying for a type of loan that allowed rural housing only. That being the case, it was as if someone had drawn a large circle around most of the communities in our area on a map and said, "You can't buy there." It was just as well though. I preferred the quiet life of country living anyway. One place in particular caught our interest. It was located in a small village called Wright, in the middle of orchard country. This town consisted of one old church with a cemetery, a bar, and a smattering of random old houses. It seemed like the perfect place for us to live. We looked at the home and thought it would suit our needs nicely. The only catch was that the two current residents were technically squatting there. It's been a long time, so I don't quite remember the exact details. I want to say they had been renting from the actual homeowner and had stopped making payments or something. Either way, the house would have to go through a short sale, and the renters/squatters had to be evicted before we could take possession. It was a combination of being weary from looking for so long, having been through the full range of emotions while doing so, and thinking it was a really cool setting, but we decided to go for it. The current tenants seemed nice, so we thought the odds were on our side that they would leave peacefully and not trash the house. Fortunately, we had no issues in that department. Unfortunately, that's because we didn't make it that far. The listing agent was quite eccentric and rarely returned calls placed by our agent. To make a long story a bit shorter, we spent 2 months trying to get somewhere with this purchase. Our offer was accepted, but nothing else happened. Every time we spoke with our realtor, she told us she couldn't even reach the listing agent. He was being so evasive. Eventually, we had enough and backed out of this bad deal. At the time, we were sad it didn't go through. Fast forward roughly a month down the road, though. We were watching the TV in our duplex one evening when the old house directly across the street from the one we'd attempted to buy showed up on the screen, on fire. Apparently, the 20-year-old kid living there had shot 3 of his family members to death, then burned the house down in an attempt at destroying the evidence. He went on a rampage around the area and then fled, and was on the run for a while. We couldn't believe it. Shivers ran down my spine when I thought about the fact that we could have very well been living in the house right across the street when he went on his murderous rampage of I still get creeped out whenever I think about that, even 13 years later. I came home around 12 a.m. to the house I share with 4 roommates. When walking on the sidewalk, I noticed a man across the street, facing the other side and seemingly doing nothing. I passed by and entered my house, locking the door behind me. I went to the kitchen, passing one of my roommates on the living room couch. The hallway from the front doorway opens into the living room and then to the kitchen. When I left the kitchen, I saw a dark outline through the door window and stopped to focus my eyes. My couched roommate looked at me confused, as in their perspective, I just suddenly stopped in my tracks for no reason. The outer door was open, and the man from across the street was looking in. Then he started jiggling the knob. As I heard the door start rattling, I yelled out to my roommate, "There's a guy at our door." My roommate got up from the couch alarmed, and we together got closer to the door. I could now see the man's face, pressed up against the door window. His eyes were blank, and he had long, oily hair. His expression made me feel extremely uncomfortable. It was almost as if he was simply staring through us, with no recognition of us even being there. My roommate called down to the basement to make sure the door leading to the backyard was locked. I got closer to the man as he kept trying the handle to go upstairs and alarm my other roommates. When we came back down, the man was no longer at the door. We peered out the window, only to see him standing in our walkway, looking across the street again. Reflecting on this, I'm happy I remembered to lock the door, because often I'd forget, and spend the night with the door unlocked. I can just imagine if the door was the same that night, and he'd stepped into our house. I wonder how the event would have went. I still think about how he probably would have walked through the hallway. My roommate on the couch would see this stranger in our living room. Surely would have scared the shit out of him. Most likely the guy was grossed out by the way his expressions was, and who knows what people on Joe's motivations may be.
What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in the comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.